Mayor Marine.
I am here.
Thank you. Councilmember Mead. All right. Councilmember Merrill.
I'm here, thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Nearing.
Here, thank you.
Thank you. Labor Representative Norton.
I'm here. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Mayor Roberts.
I'm here.
Thank you. Councilmember Schweddy.
Present.
Thank you. And Councilmember Wright has let us know she'll be arriving in progress. Chair, that does conclude the board's role, and we do have a quorum. I'll take a quick check to see what alternates we have present. Do we have Councilmember Gallagher? Okay, Councilmember Nearing. Councilmember Payne. I see you there, Councilmember. Thank you. Mayor Thompson. And Mayor Matsumoto Wright. Chair, that concludes roll. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Okay, that will take us to our public comments. We do have one written public comment that came from Joe Kunzler, who's received. Everybody on the board should have received that ahead of time. I imagine they have. We don't have anybody to speak publicly. However, if you would like to, just raise your hand using the raise hand feature under the participant button. And we will give you a few seconds to see if anybody raises their hand. Rachel, I'm not seeing anybody, but.
I'm not seeing anyone, Chair.
Okay. All right, then we will move forward with our meeting. So we have the CEO report, Mr. Ilgen Fritz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very briefly, 3 quick items. I know we have a lot of ground to cover today. So as I was logging on, I was listening to the colloquy between Mayor Roberts and the other board members about the event. And I know most of you, all of you know that we had a big groundbreaking on Tuesday, but Rachel's got a photo to share just to take one more look and celebrate one more time the start of the Orange Line project. It was a great event, and the staff did an amazing job, and I just want to express gratitude to the board for your support and your participation getting us to this point. And as you said, Mayor Roberts, the future really is now. We're on our way to connecting Snohomish County communities to this regional system, and the event went really well. And I was especially pleased that we had an opportunity for that cast of leaders to recognize the work our employees do every day, delivering the service, keeping it safe, and planning these investments and getting them ready to go. So it was a great day. I don't know why there's not sun in that picture. It seems sunnier to me in my memory, but anyway, a great day. 2 other quick things. You've heard, you saw my email the other night about the mask policy. Just to confirm that we have shifted to masks optional on board the coaches. We are continuing to provide masks on board for those who want them. And we are continuing to provide CDC guidance through our digital channels and our internal channels to our employees and customers. So they have that information available. And it was a pretty interesting day on Monday as we were trying to figure out where the feds were going to land, and a lot of calls and coordination around the region to get the transit partners on the same page. And we ultimately were able to get there by Tuesday morning. So we are aligned regionally on how we're approaching this. And last but not least, we are in the middle now of our move to the Cascade Administrative Building in the Cascade Conference Center. So this will be our last board workshop coming to you from Merrill Creek Administration. Hopefully our next board workshop will be in person and in the new building. But if you were here today, you would see a lot of boxes in the hallways. We've already moved our customer experience staff into the new building, and they are over there enjoying it today. Tim's IT folks are over there putting the finishing touches on all our technological capabilities. We've got a lot of hardware to move from this building to that building. We're recycling and reusing all of our screens and monitors and keyboards and such, but I was able to participate with the executive committee this morning from the new building and can report that the Wi-Fi is in fact working. So anyway, that's my quick report, Mr. Chair, and we can move on with the agenda unless there's any questions.
Any questions for Rick? Otherwise, we'll have him kick off our first presentation. Yeah, it looks like
Yeah, I
Councilmember
do.
Daughtry has a question.
Yeah, so Rick, I heard on the news today that Sound Transit and Kitsap Count Transit are still requiring masks. Is that not true?
I have direct communication from the GMs of both those agencies saying that they have got masks optional.
Oh, okay.
So we put out a joint press release with all the regional organizations actually during the event on Tuesday to confirm that we were applying, that we were taking a coordinated, consistent approach across all the brands.
All right, that's good. That's just what I heard on Cairo. So.
Wow.
All right, anything else? Any other questions? Otherwise, Rick, you want to kick us off our first presentation?
Great. Well, this is the fun part. With the board's support and encouragement, we have gotten started on our zero emission vehicle study. June gave us a brief update at our last workshop about where we are in terms of getting our team stood up, getting our initial research tasks completed. As a reminder, June has moved into retirement. She is continuing to provide support to Roland and his team on a temporary basis as we transition. But Roland has tapped Dee Tapia, pardon the pun, from our IT group to step in on an interim basis and take over managing the study. And she's doing a terrific job. So today we want to bring the team forward and share with you some of the things we've been learning and the direction things are headed in the industry. And I want to call particular attention to the timeline that the research we're doing and the options that we're starting to identify will come forward to the board toward the end of the year with some potential choices to make about the direction we want to go with fleet transition. So this is the study part of the work. And then the next step, as we decide where we want to focus, we'll be updating our fleet plan. And that will put us in a position to begin seeking grant opportunities with our state and federal partners. Dee's going to kick us off. We're fortunate to have our WSP consultant team with us today. They've worked across the country and in some cases across the globe. With properties who are moving into and using this technology. So they've got a great base of knowledge for us to benefit from. So Dee, with that introduction, why don't you get us going?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be leading this project for the organization. Learned a ton so far. I would like to take an opportunity to introduce the key people that have been supporting us on the WSP team. Start with Chris Wellender. He is principal in charge. We also have Peter Stackpole, who's been the deputy project manager, but also a transportation planner. So he's going to be really involved in some service modeling and things like that. And then Cliff Hankey is the VP and primary project manager, but also a global expert in zero emissions and BRT. And with that, Cliff, I'll hand it off to you to share all the things you've shared with the core team here at Community Transit and the executives.
Cliff, we can't hear you. Or I can't hear you. Can people hear Cliff?
No, I can't hear him either.
No.
No.
There we go.
All right. That's what I needed. Thanks very much. So
It's only been 2 years.
that's about the third failed device I've seen or experienced. So computer mic always works. Well, thanks everybody for your patience on that. I want to just give you a kind of a brief overview today of where we are with the project. And then the primary thing that we'll do is talk about some technologies And then I'll go into some funding opportunities and the agency-wide impacts that you can expect to consider. And then finally, Dee and I will discuss next steps. So as far as the project status is concerned, we've basically started with an evaluation of technology and road mapping of the technologies. And that's what I'll share with you today, some of the pros and cons about each of those technologies. And then very soon we will start moving into an evaluation period where we're really going to evaluate your own service in the context of these technologies. We'll take a look at the facilities and assess how these technologies would be suited within the context of your new, not only your existing facilities, but those that you have in your master plan as well. And that goes for service applications as well. Not only what exists now, but we want to make this roadmap a good one so that it incorporates future service plans that you have as well, new SWIFT lines in the works, etc. So that it becomes very important to do that. Out of that assessment comes cost estimates, impacts about change, a potential phasing timeline for how these things roll out, and then some decisions about how best to this with a final report and a recommendation. All of that will lay the groundwork for what's called a rollout plan, which is an FTA compliant vehicle, if you will, no pun intended, that will describe how best to do this in increments from 0 to 100% transition, which is now required for the primary grants at the federal level. And I'll discuss that later on in this presentation as well. To date, we've been meeting in several 4 hours to be exact of workshops with stakeholder teams, but also a workshop with the executive leadership team. And some themes have emerged out of those discussions, and I'll get to that in a minute. Today, what I want to do is to talk a little bit at a high level, some of the pros and cons of these technology choices, what to expect, how a change might affect the enterprise, because it virtually affects every aspect of the enterprise, and you'll see that from the discussion. What I will remind everybody at this point is there's going to be hopefully plenty of time for Q&A at the end, but if you have a burning question, I will certainly like to entertain it. I don't want you to forget about your questions. So please interrupt me and bring lots of questions to make this successful. Everybody has to participate. So as I mentioned, the merging themes of this presentation, or the series of meetings and workshops, have been basically 7 of them. Charging options and infrastructure, the scalability of those options and the constraints associated with the technology options, because there are technology constraints, as you will see in a moment. The zero emission vehicles for non-revenue vehicles and for paratransit was something also that became curious. You hear a lot of information out there about the buses and the regular route vehicles, but what about some of the other vehicles in your fleet that you need to transition? And so there was some questions about that as well. Also a comprehensive wells to wheels, if you will, from the sourcing of electricity and hydrogen to how it is consumed throughout the supply chain, all the way to the actual vehicle consumption. That full comprehensive environmental greenhouse gas emission analysis was also something that was looked upon as an interesting thing to explore when we talk about the comprehensive comparison between these. Operational suitability, very important, and interoperability, especially with other fleets in the region, if there would be shared charging or technologies, for example. Leveraging funding opportunities was obviously a very important theme that emerged. Just what kind of money is out there, and I'll touch on that. And then finally, workforce development issues, which become a very, very important consideration. As I said, particularly now that it is a federal requirement to address those as far as eligibility requirements for the industry. So just kind of at the highest level, the available bus types that are out there and the manufacturers. These range from roughly $700,000, depending on what kinds of bells and whistles, what kinds of procurement vehicles, such as the statewide procurement vehicle, the volumes of a bus order will sometimes lower that unit price a little bit. But the range basically on battery electric buses, with more than 5 manufacturers now in the market and 6 and possibly 7 very soon, ranges from about a 700,000, 800,000 to $1 million or more. Fuel cell buses carry with them a premium currently, partly due to the nascence of the technology, and partly due to because there is only 2, possibly 3 or 4 manufacturers of buses that will supply fuel cell propulsion technology in the market. So that's basically the range on the bus side. Available charging technologies. So there's basically flavors of, if you will, of charging technologies at the base, at the depot, as well as what's called opportunity charging, which is on the route system of your bus network. And they basically boil down to a couple of the same choices, which on the base charging, you have plug-in technology, you have gantry overhead pantograph technology. And the way these pantographs work are sort of the reverse of what you see on trolley buses for King County Metro. The pantograph, instead of going from the vehicle to the wires, comes down from the wires, if you will, or the charging system to the vehicle via some charge rails on the roof structure of the bus. And that's how the batteries are charged with a pantograph system. And then the inductive charging is in ground, and there's some energy loss with inductive charging, but there is a transponder or an interface on the undercarriage of the vehicle that picks up the inductive charging, and that is only energized when the vehicle is on top of that in-ground charging system, and that can be applied in the base, somewhere in the base property, or it can be applied on out somewhere. I know that Seaway is one of those transit centers that Everett Transit is looking at constructing some en route charging that would be inductive in-ground charging. But gantry overhead charging is a very common application as well for opportunity charging. This is an example of kind of the cost comparisons associated with a variety of these technologies, ranging from clean diesel as a baseline to battery electric or technology, or even diesel hybrid. This was a snapshot in time, if you will, at AC Transit, one of those deploy of these. And what's interesting about AC Transit, and we're trying to line up a potential tour for some of you at AC Transit, is that they are doing an interesting procurement whereby they will acquire the exact same number of fuel cell vehicles as battery electric vehicles, run them on the same routes and the same sort of schedules, and then compare the data and use that data to help determine, partly to inform their decisions going forward as far as their full transition. In California, all of the transit operators are required to transition by 2040. Many of them are either already transitioned, such as Antelope Valley, a suburban agency in the county of Los Angeles, or have a much more aggressive time schedule for transitioning, including AC Transit, which wants to transition by 2035. LA Metro still has a board commitment to transition by 2030. But these are roughly sort of the reliability, the fleet availability, the cost per mile, the fleet mileage experience that is been compiled so far at AC Transit. And by the way, all of these metrics will also be used as we evaluate your, inform your decision, which is what this phase of the project will culminate in, is advice to inform you on a decision.
Hey, Cliff, just 1 second for you. All of that makes sense to me, and I understand that last slide, except that first line, the grouping. What I don't understand with the series grouping.
That's nomenclature it's just a
Okay.
grouping, a series grouping at AC Transit. That's all.
All right, thank
In
you.
fact, in retrospect, to avoid confusion, I probably should have deleted that. But yeah, it's just basically AC Transit's nomenclature for their vehicles and when they acquired them, et cetera. Boiled down, this is kind of what it looks like with the baseline. You're talking about a cost differential for battery electric over clean diesel buses. On a more or less 200 bus order, about a 50% premium with an implementation baseline, anywhere from 2 to 4, if you really wanted to get aggressive about it as far as vehicle acquisition is concerned. Vehicle acquisition is a little longer, and I'll explain that with these zero emission vehicles. Hydrogen is actually a little shorter in the vehicle acquisition process, mainly because there are fewer orders of hydrogen these days. Even though there are more manufacturers, the implementation baseline tends to be a little longer because there's just a lot more vehicles being ordered right now that are battery electric versus fuel cell. Although fuel cell is ramping up a little bit. Plug-in chargers, for a 200 bus order, you're talking about a $14 million premium, and this is just average of the average of the average. About a 3 to 5 year implementation baseline. Simultaneous to that implementation baseline, by the way, will be some discussions with your utility, because you're going to need a method of service study and some other things. And quite often, that method of service study and some of the other discussions that you need for increasing your service at your property often take as long or longer than the actual build out of the infrastructure to serve your vehicles. Overhead charger type systems run a little bit more expensive. Again, part of this is just the maturity of the market is greater for plug-in chargers. There's a lot more of a variety. The simplicity of the complex also tends to be greater simplicity as you implement these at a base versus what is required with an overhead gantry system. And then fueling infrastructure can range from $5 million for, say, 35 vehicles to $35 million for a base 200 bus base that needs to be converted entirely. That said, implementation timeframes tend to be faster with hydrogen fuel cell because a lot of the suppliers can do this in a containerized way. Some of the fueling infrastructure for hydrogen fuel cell actually happens to be skid mounted, which is very interesting. And so there's a lot of interesting design solutions out there with respect to hydrogen fueling infrastructure. To address interoperability at this point. So there have been for a while now industry standards for being able to do plug-in charging at the base. Within the past 2 years, industry standards have also been introduced for overhead gantry charging, which has led to a lot of interoperability advantages. So if you're, Society Automotive Engineers, SAE J3105 compliant in your specifications, very likely you will be able to you'll have interoperability with gantry charging at opportunity charging locations at bases. If you had to, have an emergency stop within King County Metros or Sound Transit's base, or at an operator location that's shared by multiple operators, such as Seaway, for example. In-ground charging is problematic. It's not there yet. It's kind of a Betamax problem, where both of the manufacturers of in-ground chargers are fighting amongst themselves about their turf and their technical approach. I am told that the SAE committee that charged with negotiating among the players have some sort of tentative agreement. In principle, this needs to happen, but there's still a bit of a food fight, if you will, over technical requirements. And so interoperability on these opportunity in-ground chargers or base in-ground chargers has not been achieved yet. And then hydrogen fuel cell, hydrogen fueling is fully interoperable, and it has been for years. So those are just some, things to think about when you talk about interoperable, or, at transfer facilities and some other things that are going on at your operation. So in sum, here is a kind of a range of pros and cons of these technologies. I won't dwell on this too much in the interest of time, but I could entertain kind of a question right now about any of this, and certainly you'll get a copy of the presentation to kind of go over it, and also you can ping me at any time with questions, or Dee with questions about this. These are certainly the issues that we'll address as we go forward in our analysis. Okay. One question I'd like to pose for discussion, however, is what is the most important, issue to you, board member, as a key staff member, as a citizen, as a member of the community, regarding a transition to zero emission fleets. And I open that up for anybody who would like to just comment a little bit.
Yeah, Kim, go ahead.
Well, mine has always been waste stream at the end of useful life of batteries for the battery bus. The other thing that I'm hearing in the news lately is that there's going to be a real hard time getting some of the elements that goes into a battery, because China has kind of a stronghold on that. So I'm really interested, and I'm coming at this from the side of, as I was in nuclear power for a long time. So waste streams were something we worried about. And as you can see, with what's going on in the state of Washington right now at Hanford, it is a big problem. And I'm not saying that this is on the same plateau as that, but it is something with the heavy metals and stuff that we still have to watch in the waste stream. So I'm very interested in how that's going to be handled. I would assume that there's going to be some companies that are going to start a new business of trying to, collect all that stuff and reuse it as they can.
Absolutely. And also the new infrastructure bill that I'll get to in a second is throwing a lot of money at standing up domestic battery production as well. The waste stream, though, is a huge issue, and there are a number of interesting technical developments that are underway, solid state batteries and other sorts of approaches to try to minimize the use of those the use of those rare earth metals. That is definitely an issue, though, and it will be addressed in our work going forward.
Mayor Frizzell?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that Kim is on this call, on this meeting, because I don't know all of the ins and outs of those kinds of issues. So I get a good education. My biggest concern is climate impact. And of course, I've got 2 kids, and I want to make sure that we're not messing up the planet any more than we already have. So that's my biggest concern.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we will certainly
then-
give a full analysis of greenhouse gas impacts too in our work. What we like to do too is show, we'll try to we'll monetize those environmental impacts. Sometimes they're non-cash, but they can be monetized, and we can show the full range of economic analysis tied to greenhouse gas and other environmental benefits of these as well. And we'll do that in our analysis as well.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, any other questions on this portion?
Yeah, back on what Christine said, and I value your input, Christine. If we're looking at the environment and the zero emissions, when we look at how all of that comes to be, are we talking about from manufacturing all the way through to use, or are we just talking about our buses are zero emission?
At the very least, we'll talk about from the production of the fuel / electricity, the source and how that's produced, as well as consumption and how it reaches the wheels, if you will, and the supply chain involved. I know that the comprehensive analyses that include the manufacture of the vehicles and the, production and, so what we'll try to do as best as we can to give you a comprehensive look at that. There may be some, you'll probably, in some of our workshops, later on, you'll probably be able to, well, what about this? What about that? And we'll have to go back and assess those. But that's what your involvement will be for, is to make sure that we address it as comprehensively as you want us to.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Tom?
Yes, I like the discussion so far, and I don't have a #1 priority to add to the ones that are in there. I did want to throw my support behind knowing what the total environmental impact is from the manufacture of the bus and the fuel systems and the fuel for it through disposal at end of life. Because I think that to Mayor Frizzell's point, the green impact is the total end to end of everything. One of the points that I would want to make sure that we stay on and keep an eye on is that, since these are emerging technologies, is to pay a lot of attention to where the standards are and the people that are following that. So as various manufacturers try to do a lock-in so that you're committed to their technology, that we don't do that and end up with orphan technology sitting out there later on as the industry begins to standardize on ways of doing business and the kind of fuel cells.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I agree with all of those questions from beginning to end, right, in terms of how is it zero emission. But the The other thing I think we need to consider is the kind of life cycle as well. Does a electric bus have extra maybe 2 to 3 years life on it, more than a diesel bus, and take that into consideration? It may be more expensive in the front end, but if it lasts longer, those sorts of things I think would be important as well, as compared to fuel cell as to electric to diesel. And the maintenance side, there's costs or savings kind of both ways.
Yeah, we'll definitely look at operations and maintenance costs as well. What we found is that the data about maintenance costs is beginning to emerge.
Yeah.
There's been this notion that maintenance costs, obviously, because there are fewer moving parts, there's fewer things because you don't have an internal combustion engine and a conventional drivetrain. But it hasn't been well documented yet. I mean, A, because the technology is relatively new and there's not a lot of buses in operation, but also B, there have been unforeseen maintenance costs, like the time that's been spent on balancing batteries and doing some other things that are maintenance related to the battery packs and other aspects, you know, in the well. And so that being said, we're starting to see data that show some promise.
Yeah, we just didn't have any data to look at. Yeah, so now that,
Right.
yeah, so that's all good stuff.
Yeah, we'll definitely look at all of that.
And it looks like Mayor Fazell has another.
It has one more, yes.
You know, and I'm probably showing my ignorance here, but I'm feeling vulnerable, so it's all good.
There are no ignorant questions.
Okay, so we talk about zero emissions, but is there a way that we can have negative emissions in some ways, so that not only are we not harming the planet, but is there a way that we're putting something good back into the planet?
Like ozone scrubbers on the bus?
You know, I don't know. I'm just saying, hey, maybe we could do better than zero emissions.
That's interesting. And I'm not aware of anything, but you know, one of the things that a lot of manufacturers will do is they'll buy carbon credits on the carbon markets to get to zero or net, negative zero, to show their environmental stewardship. I guess one could get really aggressive in your procurement documents and require them to do that.
Wouldn't that be a great marketing thing? Come ride our bus and make the environment better.
Yeah, I say that with a mischievous, look on my face. But I mean, I suppose you could do that. It's, but we'll take a look at it as comprehensively as we can. But that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
And it's like Jan and Rick.
Okay, just a quick question. Do we have any idea the difference in cost of electrical charging a bus and diesel fuel?
Yes. So what we try to do is monetize, it in sort of diesel gallon equivalents and other. We will look at the costs that are related to the consumption of the energy at the source of the charging or fueling. And so we'll definitely do a comparison between sort of no build, which is clean diesel. We'll do an analysis of your operating costs, including hydrogen fueling. And then we'll also look at the operating costs associated with charging. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
All right. Now, also, we want to keep going. We got 20 more slides, I understand. And
We
so
do, yes.
if we can hold a few, let's go a little further on and hold a couple questions. Thank you, Tom.
My question is not, my comment was in addition to the response to Mayor Frizzell. I just wanted to point out that the percentage of transit vehicles out there is relatively small compared to the rest of the vehicles on the road. But where we make our biggest impact, and we can analyze and quantify this, is the number of people we carry, the amount we grow ridership, and the number of trips we eliminate in single occupant vehicles. So that can be part of the analysis, Mayor Frizzell.
And I do have a slide that sort of gets that.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm done.
Sir. So you also, I was asked to take a look at, available funding programs. I'm going to handle kind of the latest and greatest from the feds first. And that's, unprecedented amounts of money, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed, this past fall, which was also authorizing legislation for the public transportation federal assistance program. And it was about a 10-fold increase in the Lono grant program and about a 50% or so increase in the bus and bus facilities grant program. But the bad news is that in the past, those have been oversubscribed by 5 times. So hopefully this massive increase in the Lono grant program to over $1 billion a year will now sort of take care of some of the oversubscription. Because of the authorization bill, some policy changes were added. And so a fleet transition plan, which this study will help lay the groundwork for development of a transition plan later, after the study is concluded, will be the sort of satisfy the eligibility aspect of that grant program for community transit. And then there's more favorable matching as well. 10% local match on infrastructure and 15% local match for the vehicles, which is better than the 80-20 traditional. And that, as you can see, is over 5 years. So that 10-fold increase is not just a bump for 2022, it's a bump for 5 years hence. So it's a huge increase in Lono funding by the feds, thanks to that bipartisan bill. There are some interesting programs at the state level as well. And so there's been recently enacted, and I'm trying to sink my teeth into this one that just passed, called Move Ahead Washington. $1.2 billion for the 2022-2023 cycle. Money for SWIFT, money for zero emission, money for clean streets or green streets, and it's about $500 million for Snohomish County investments. So it's at the discretion, I believe, of program administrators, but it's a significant amount of money. The Volkswagen Mitigation Trust for this cycle still has some money in it. In the past, it's been used to partially fund about 66 zero emission electric buses. Obviously that the math doesn't work. It wasn't 100% of the total. It was basically seed money for those 66. And then there's the Cap and Trade Climate Commitment Fund that's to be determined, but it's likely going to be a discretionary fund as well. And it's $127 million. We will take a look at these programs, our funding and finance people, in greater depth, and have more for you as this project ensues. But that's the good news at the state level. And were that not enough, there's also programs in the Department of Energy, thanks to the Biden infrastructure bill, that will be administered by the State Energy Office or directly by the U.S. Department of Energy and their regional offices. And those tend to want partnerships, whether it's the utility or the community or some other partnership, but it's another, stream of resources that could be tapped and attendant requirements for each of those. So partnerships are welcome, basically. So now what I'd like to do is talk about kind of the enterprise-wide impacts, how it would affect, all of the aspects of community transit. And I have called and written about this before. I think it represents a significant impact to any agency. It's kind of every agency who undertakes this. The Space Needle in the background is not, by accident. It is the space program for any agency undertaking this. And we can talk about this. How do you think the zero emission transition program would affect the agency? Either externally or internally, how would you think it would affect?
Was that a question?
Yeah, any thoughts?
Well, we're hoping that you're going to tell us how it does it internally. I think externally, it will get people, as I think it was alluded to before, as kind of an opportunity to draw people in, right? Because they're not only, they're doing something good for the environment by riding the bus as well. There's another sort of selling point, if you will. But how it affects internally, that's kind of hoping you're here to tell us.
Thank you for that prompt.
Well, I think one of the things we're going to have a problem with is maintenance, mechanics. I mean, it's just like when the horseless carriage came in, the horse buggy people had a problem with that. So now you've got diesel mechanics that are on, our mechanics, diesel mechanics. Now we're going to transition to electrics or whatever hydrogen fuel is. Hydrogen fuel is still electric motors going to the axles. So there's going to be some changes. I'm hoping that they can just learn and stay on.
Yeah, the short answer is that it will affect virtually every aspect of the organization. And I'm going to walk through the next few slides here to kind of just give you examples, and there's probably many others that you can think of as well as I walk through this, of illustrations of how it will affect, it will have operational impacts, obviously. How the schedule is affected. You got to make sure that, if there's charging that's somewhere on the network, because these buses right now, the battery electric buses have insufficient range. And so you're either going to have to come up with some additional vehicles, you're going to have to split your routes in a different way, or you're going to have to allow in the schedule some place that they can do what's called opportunity charging on the route somewhere. Fuel cell buses have a longer range, but you'd be surprised that they don't have the range that diesel has. It has about a 300-mile range, but it's still short of the 400-mile range that diesel has. So there's lots of different implications with respect to operations alone. On facilities, you're looking at whether it's a battery electric solution or a fuel cell solution. You're looking at some space loss, some space constraint. It's about a 30% for battery electric. You have major installation impacts that have to be designed. They can be designed above ground, or they can be designed below ground or at surface. Some of the solutions that are gantry based are pretty slick because they have less impact with circulation, but you need to also have, a roof structure that can support an overhead system in your facilities. On the hydrogen side, you're looking at least a half an acre for the smallest on-site production of hydrogen. It is more scalable, as I said earlier, but you still are looking at a pretty big chunk of the yard that needs to be consumed for a fueling, compression, and a fueling system. And one of the workarounds that's out there is a firewall barrier that takes care of some gaseous fueling regulations that are, where that's required. Buses can also share pumps, and that can minimize impacts as well. On procurement, as I said earlier, you're looking at longer lead times for procurement of these vehicles and longer times for procurement of the design and construction facilities for the infrastructure side of this. There are fewer competitors typically, but regardless of the solution. There is a mismatch, although it is getting better, between those who have a lot more experience delivering just transit buses in general in the market versus their experience delivering zero emission buses. As I said, as the share of those vehicles that are zero emission increases over time, and they are indeed increasing over time, that experience, which turns into QA, QC, quality of vehicle, better cost, all of those things that are associated with just better manufacturing experience are getting better. And what's important to note is the last point. It's one thing to buy a bunch of buses. You need to buy a bunch of buses in a time frame where your facilities are ready, because the facility modifications are the critical path in these projects, not the bus acquisition. Because if you don't acquire your buses in a well-timed way, you're basically going to have a bunch of buses that can't be charged anywhere. So it's a very important consideration. Impacts on service planning, how you do your bus assignments. Different route types have different, sort of performance. You've got to do this in a way where the planning's robust, because there will be service changes later to address ridership, increase opportunities or decrease because of COVID. Or come up, the unknown unknowns, if you will. So it's important to have modeling that models the worst possible scenario, but also modeling that can be robust and you can adjust with the flow. Impacts on IT, cybersecurity, very important issue these days. Charge management technology will rapidly improve how the vehicles get charged at the base, and that will help you buy down the cost of your infrastructure and how much charge load, electrical load you'll need to ask, Snohomish PUD for at the facility. Communications interfaces are critical in this, and interference issues and systems analysis becomes important as the vehicles get more complex. And then of course, warranty changes and warranty issues are always an issue with IT, aren't they? Well, it is going to be the same with buses as well. Impacts on community relations and marketing. Something as simple as, do you want to brand and advertise the fact that you've got a new fleet and you're transitioning? Well, that's kind of a sub-fleet until it becomes your total fleet at some point. Contingency planning is critical. Particularly, if there's something as catastrophic that happens with, what happened in Stuttgart, Germany, with a fire that spread to 5 or 6 vehicles before they could put it out. It's the kind of thing that, contingency plans are important. And then of course, it's important to note that these are policy decisions. The return on investment, we believe, will be there ultimately, but it's not really there yet because of the premium that you're paying for the vehicle modifications and the infrastructure modifications. And because of that, it's not really a business case or an economics, case yet. It's a policy decision, and it needs to be marketed and messaged as such. Budgets and strategic plans become important. Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Lance. I don't know if he had a question or not. Oh, maybe he didn't.
Looks like he's muted.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Lance.
Okay. Is it possible, and I'm sure you looked at it, to take a regular standard 30-foot, 40-foot, or an Arctic and convert the bus itself to emission-free? You know what I'm saying? Go from a diesel, just take the carcass of the bus, the windows, the seats, the size of it and everything, and convert it over.
Yeah. Yes.
Can that be done?
And in the case of, so there are midlife overhauls where, a lot of buses are basically remanufactured, where you pull the old drivetrain out and reconfigure it. We will look at that. The business case for that has not materialized for other agencies where we've worked. They just rather buy a new vehicle. But LA, for example, because they're a little behind in their procurement schedule to meet their 2030 goal, they're definitely looking at that.
Okay.
And so we can probably benefit for some experience of other agencies that are looking at this, and we can show you that data. But right now, the business case for that hasn't been determined. Hasn't really materialized because the amount that's needed to remanufacturing of an existing bus, the cost differential is pretty narrow, I would say.
Oh, okay.
That's basically the answer.
Thank you.
But we're continuing to look at it. And then the other aspect of this is that costs will narrow at some point between the old technology and the new technology. We think they'll narrow mid-2030. So on policies, I wrote this article for Metro Magazine this past fall. This has really only begun, and it is akin to the space program. Strategic planning decisions, rapid technology evolution, partnerships with utilities, which is novel for, our industry, right? You don't usually seek a partnership with your host partnership anyway, with utility. You don't, in public-private partnerships and different kinds of approaches are emerging in the market right now. Workforce development amid a generational turnover could be the singular issue right now. And of course, it's a big concern to the agency, to the FDA right now. And then, close coordination with, your labor representation becomes really important. Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, I just had a quick thought and a comment, and I think maybe your article kind of touches on it, but I'm just wondering, it's only been 35 years ago that I bought my first computer and it had 30 megabyte hard drive. I'm just wondering kind of where you think we're at on the spectrum of change. If an agency went all in on something, do they run the risk, in 5-10 years of having an outdated
Excellent question. And what we're finding is because of the rapid improvements in energy density of batteries and the rapid improvements of efficiency of electrical motors and the electric energy management on board, et cetera, we're finding that the range differential between battery electric and fuel cell has narrowed substantially even within the last 18 months. And that will continue, particularly if solid state batteries begin to emerge. And we think what we're hearing right now is solid state batteries and the attendant, breakthrough in energy density, which is, energy for weight, raw weight, basically, improves dramatically through the late 2020s. You're going to see that range narrow even further. And so that takes away one of the advantages of fuel cell, for example. And so we're going to look at that for you. What kind of rapid technological improvement and how that path, will affect. When I worked at CalSTART, for example, we had just won the National Fuel Cell Bus, demonstration program just to run it. And then about, 3 or 4 years later, I caught up with my colleagues saying, how's the program going? What kind of experience you're seeing? And they said, we're seeing rapid technology evolution on the battery side, but not so much on the fuel cell side. And that continues to this day, frankly. And like computers, it could follow a Moore's law sort of evolution. Not that dramatic of an improvement, doubling over 18 months, but certainly, 10 to 15% a year improvements we're seeing in the market.
Okay, thank you.
This is to, to your CEO's point about, let's keep in mind that the real impacts are the direct and indirect effects that you have every day on, greenhouse gas reduction because you get people out of their cars. And so it's not to say you can't do both. In fact, you need to do both, right? You need to make your vehicles greener, but you also need to do it in a way that, that preserves the reliability of your service. And so that's the point of this slide. And with that, the real question is how to do this transition in a way that does it with as little disruption as possible. That's what we'll explore for you, later on in a phasing kind of proposed phasing schedule at a high level that then gets looked at in a deeper dive in the second phase of the study. Lessons that we've learned in all of the ones out there that we've done 50 or more projects in zero emission worldwide, is early and continuous relationships with utilities, constant dialogue. The facility and many of these utilities don't realize just how much power or how much hydrogen you're talking about buying from them. It's the equivalent of a skyscraper, or even two skyscrapers, or a light rail line. It's a lot of power. Facilities investments are the critical path, as I said before. When we model, we're going to model for worst case because we want to be as comprehensive in our modeling as possible for you. Because you don't want just your worst route, heaviest use day. You want your worst route in the worst, climate conditions, in the worst, topography and other conditions on a hellacious traffic day. You want that kind of condition model too. We'll account for the complexity of your route network. We'll address, your service area, because larger service areas tend to be more challenging because of topography and, even microclimates, right? The funding is a challenge for everybody. Fortunately, there's a lot more of it now. But knowing those funding deadlines and the notices of opportunity, we have a practice in our business, for example, that, it knows this stuff and has good relationships with the FTA and knows what's coming down the pike. And so, we'll be as much of a sentinel as we can to you. And then, just the job skills and all those things that are, the labor impacts become really, really important. So Dee, I'll turn it over to you.
I have a question first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
So thinking about the topography of what we do with some of our longer bus routes going out to like Darrington, Sultan, places like that, where the electric buses might have a little bit of a problem getting there in one go. Is your study going to include the possibility of having both battery electric buses and hydrogen fuel cell buses?
Yes. One of the things that you don't want to do is create sub-fleets, but it might become necessary to create one.
Okay.
You know, just, but we'll look at both. And that will be ultimately, your decision, right? So you're
Well, looking
as
at
an
both,
agent.
I meant by having both types of buses in our fleet. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I mean, AC Transit, Orange County Transit Authority is doing it. There's a number of agencies that have a mixed fleet, propulsion wise.
Thank
And
you.
of course, you already have that, right, with your diesel electric hybrids and your, diesel buses as well. So, but
Great.
everything gets more complicated as you get a more complicated fleet.
Thank you, Cliff, for all of that great industry information and so much to think about for us as we move into this next phase of our work, which is a deeper dive. We'll be back to this group in the summer sometime for another workshop where we're going to focus more on how this applies to community transit. What are our unique challenges? And in order to do that, WSP needs to come out and do a facilities assessment. They've already seen our master plan phases with Greg Stamatillo. They're going to look at doing some service assessments. That means service modeling and looking at our 2024 plan and looking deep into some of the data that we're creating for that. We're going to be visiting some of the other agencies that have implemented this and are a little further along with hydrogen, battery electric, and a mix. And bringing those findings back to community transit. We'll also be exploring a lot of energy options. There's more out there than just PUD, but PUD is going to be a critical partner as well. But there's talk of solar and battery storage and hydrogen farms, and the sky's the limit. And I'm just learning, so I'm sure there's a lot more. We also are going to talk a little bit about public-private partnerships and what those might look like for community transit. And we've developed some subgroups within the organization where we can transfer knowledge specifically from WSP and industry knowledge into community transit as it relates to zero emissions, such as funding subgroups, such as a workforce development. And then we have some of these subgroups where we'll be really taking a much deeper dive into the impacts in service, funding, fleet management, infrastructure, et cetera. So we're looking forward to sharing a lot more with you in the summer. And just as a point of reference, all of these highlighted areas are areas that are involved, impacted, providing consulting, are part of our core team for this work. So it really does touch every aspect of the agency in some way, as you can see from just the highlights on the org chart.
Right. Thanks very much. Apologies to the next presentation.
Well, clearly you can see the excitement around what you guys are doing, and we're hoping, great things that we can make some decisions over. Before we move on though, Tom, did we kind of cut you off before? Did you have something you wanted to ask before we move along?
Well, I've had something that emerged from before we wanted to do that. And I just wanted to, really wanted to emphasize this because we bring up something that is one of my big soapboxes on big technology change. And I didn't see it explicitly drawn out in the plan, but that is that somewhere after we've started choosing the technologies and start working on it, I really, really, really recommend that you have a change management expert on board that begins drawing up the plans on how the change management will actually work within the human element of the company and how these things roll out and what the education is, what the communication plan is, and make sure that that is deeply embedded in it. The issues that I have personally run in before is each supervisor thinks they're a change management expert and they're not. Mm-hmm. So I suggest that become a key part of the plan as it begins to emerge. So thank you. That's my soapbox.
This is probably where I probably shouldn't admit that my academic background is in change management.
As is mine.
Perfect position there. Well, thank you, Cliff, Peter, Chris, and Dee. We look forward to more of the reports.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we've got a long range plan.
Yeah,
Journey to 2050, huh?
Good segue as we leave the zero emission discussion. I'll observe we're all very used to working with our partners here in the region. We think of Sound Transit and King County as our neighbors. We have a neighbor to the east who's way ahead of the rest of us on this topic, on the zero emission topic, Link Transit over in Wenatchee. And that's one of the visits that Dee is planning. And I would encourage, as that comes together, for you to consider visiting either as part of our trip or when you're over there yourselves. But my counterpart over there has been real clear that, the keys here are change management and the relationship with the utility, as well as the workforce development stuff. So anyway, more to come, and we're super excited about learning. The next topic is the long range plan, and you've been hearing a lot about the 2024 network plan, and that's tackling changes that we're managing over the next 3 to 5 years as we get ready for the Linwood Link project to open. Thinking further ahead, obviously the zero emission transition as we undertake it will take longer and perhaps doesn't have a time frame affixed to it yet, depending on what we learn later in the year. But the long range plan update is looking beyond 2024 to 2050 to help us get aligned with the PSRC's growth and transportation plans for the region. And we know that light rail will continue moving north to Everett. And we know that, population growth and employment growth, even though our practices and how we do these things and how we live have changed because of the pandemic, those growth rates are going to continue here in the region. We're continuing to attract population from outside. We're continuing to grow organically. And so this is an opportunity for us to articulate how we want to show up to support that growth longer term. And so we're creating this layer cake of plans to guide our efforts as we move beyond the present and into the future and think ahead to life after light rail. So I want to turn it over to the planning staff. Thomas Tamola, I think, is going to take us through this, and we'll be looking for your feedback and your thoughts on the direction we're taking this. Like the zero emission study, we have our consultant team here from Fair and Peers. Aaron Goose is our project manager, and he does a great job on this stuff. We're beginning to shape different planning scenarios to consider, and we'll be looking for your reactions to that today. So Thomas, thanks.
Thank you, Rick. And I'm going to introduce Aaron Goose from Fair and Peers. She'll be given the core presentation today. We're at another little fork in the road of this 18-month study where we're about to sort of launch into another phase of outreach this summer, kind of getting some feedback on how we want to grow our system beyond 2024, looking at some distinct kind of primary color type of exercise of how we might want to rearrange our overall mobility portfolio. So I'm going to pass it over to Aaron. I know we're a little bit up against the clock today, but there's definitely a punchline here, a place for it kind of to react to and to spend some time getting some interactive discussion going. So Aaron, it's all you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Rick, for the introduction, and appreciate the time with you all to get you updated on where we are in this process, and really look for some of your feedback and guidance as we get into the next phase. So I'll just walk through, again, briefly what we're touching on today. So we're going to get you all up to speed on where we are within the project phasing. We want to recap the survey results from the phase 1 survey that was out this winter. And then a bulk of the time will be really focused on the scenario development and getting your insight and guidance as we get into the more technical phase of this study. And then we'll touch on just general schedule and next steps. So really overall objectives of our presentation today is really seeking your input on just your reaction to some of the survey responses and some of those key findings that we summarized, and then specifically getting your input and feedback on the scenarios. Nothing needs to be decided with today. It's really just getting your guidance as we get into this next phase and ensuring we're on the right track moving forward. So first off, just again, overall project timeline where we are. So we had the phase one really visioning market assessment over the later part of 2021 into 2022, which then kicked off a phase one outreach engagement with CBOs and the public and other stakeholders to really understand broader priorities at that long range time horizon. So where we are now is getting into the phase two and in the scenario development. So this is that key junction point in this process where we take a lot of the feedback we've heard in phase one, transition into phase two to put some numbers and technical analysis behind that. Just to orient again, as we're, Rick touched on 2024 network planning, you're, evaluating zero emissions. There's a lot of different time horizons at play here. And so the long range plan, again, we're looking 20 plus years out, in theory, a horizon year of 2050. And that really speaks to your long-term priorities. It's really, setting the stage for the overall vision and guidance on how you want to grow over those next few years. That gets implemented and executed through your more near-term planning processes. The transit development plan, which carries that 6-year horizon and is updated annually. And then that really plays out into your annual budget, which is the final execution of operating and investing in some of those capital procedures. So you can kind of, again, see where the long-range plan fits in within some of your existing planning processes. And so a long-range plan with that in mind really, gets at the core of your mission, your vision, and the values of community transit. And I know we touched on this during our October workshop, but just to, again, reiterate where a long-range plan fits in with your overall process. So your mission, we help people get from where they are to where they need to be, speaks to the overall vision, travel made easy for all. And then you have your core values listed here. And so the long-range plan, again, is really about thinking through your mission, your vision, your core values of, what makes community transit exist and why you're there to provide the benefit to the community. And so the long-range plan really tries to identify those specific goals for how you will grow and adapt over the next 20 to 30 years, really incorporating the community input to help guide you in that process. So that gets into really specifically kind of, as I alluded to, the priorities of what is the role of community transit. And I understand, there are some different board members. So what we really touched on in that first workshop in the fall was around these 3 key themes for priorities and where community transit stands in terms of advancing these priorities within the region. So we talked about equity. And really focusing your efforts on how can you expand service for those who rely on transit the most, where it's their primary means of mobility and accessing those opportunities such as education and employment. Efficiency, again, is really centered around how to best operate the system, how to provide service where demand is the greatest and operate in the most efficient manner. And then finally, environmental is all about how you can advance mode shift and really help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through your service. And the prior presentation on zero emission vehicles is one part of that solution. The other is how to provide service that can allow for more people to use those services. So if you recall in our fall workshop, we had a discussion and kind of walked through how you would rank the priority of these 3 themes. And the overall results leaned a bit towards efficiency, acknowledging equity and environment as other key priorities. And what we really want to state from that workshop is all 3 obviously are important. And you as a board acknowledge that all 3 are important. And so as we get into this scenario evaluation, what we're looking to do is to understand how do different modes, how do different services advance these 3 priorities so you can get a better sense of the role of community transit moving forward to best fulfill efficiency or best fulfill equity or environment, here is the mix of services, here is how a service could be allocated would best fulfill those priorities. So keep that in mind as we're talking through what is the role of the scenario evaluation for this long range plan, and how do these priorities kind of continue that theme throughout that analysis. So with that in mind, I want to transition now into talking through the recap of the survey that was conducted over the course of mostly the month of February. And big picture, what were we looking for? There had just been a survey related to the 2024 network. So that was more tactical, kind of related to specific transit characteristics, specific network elements that you all were looking for feedback on. So the survey for the long range plan was more visionary and thinking about broader priorities and asking the community kind of how they thought about equity, efficiency, and the environment through several different questions. We leveraged primarily online advertising, on-bus notifications, rack cards, et cetera, to get the word out using some of our CBO interviews as connections to the broader community to really help amplify the messaging around the survey. And we received over 400 responses. And this was, again, I'd call a fairly successful effort given the level of investment with the notification. It was a crowded winter of surveys and a lot of messaging. And so it was still really great to see this level of involvement and really springboards us into our outreach in the summer, where we'll amplify our notifications, particularly through mailers, to really expand the level of response. And then to the final bullet, we reviewed what were the demographics of the respondents. Was it consistent with kind of broader Snohomish County trends? And overall, for all the demographic variables, whether it's income, race, et cetera, they were fairly consistent with those countywide averages. Just one note that we do want to highlight is the percentage of respondents that are current or previous transit riders was fairly high. Only less than 10% had never used community transit. So keep that in mind as we're conveying these results, that it was generally a respondent population that was mostly people who are using your services today, or maybe just pre-pandemic had been using the services. And what we're looking to do with the next phase of outreach is expand those responses to include more non-riders in the survey. So first question I want to highlight is on the key features of high quality transit. And so the highest ranking element was around themes around convenience and accessibility. The next was providing reliable and on-time service. Next was efficiency and speed, and then providing kind of multimodal solutions. And these findings are consistent with what we've seen through other systems. The other question was related to, again, the role of community transit and how community transit can improve the quality of life within Snohomish County. And the top ranking response was about getting people to where they need to be, providing that efficient service, that efficient connection. And then the next was on providing options for those where the primary transportation mode is transit. And that speaks more to kind of the equity theme as we think about priorities. Next was reducing traffic congestion. That again speaks to both kind of an environmental efficiency theme, and then reducing the number of people driving alone. Again, kind of an efficiency and environmental theme. But broadly, what was interesting to see from these results is, again, people highly value high quality transit within Snohomish County. And these broader themes about where it's most beneficial will really highlight some of the evaluation that we want to conduct in the scenario analysis. A few other specific questions we wanted to highlight here today is we asked people just what do they see as the most important investments for community transit? And the highest ranking was adding service where there currently is none. And so this will be a crucial element we'll evaluate with the scenario analysis to understand how do you fill in some of the gaps? How do you best look to create new connections where there's not service today? The next was real-time information at stops. Related to your previous presentation, zero emission transit vehicles, there's strong support to look at that. And then the fourth highest ranking was on really expanding the investment in your SWIFT BRT system. And then a final one that I want to touch on is just new investment priorities. So thinking about either services or elements that you aren't providing today, or enhancing some of those. The top ranking was on kind of apps or online services that really help with trip planning or during your trip, helping you navigate the system. A fairly high percentage spoke to the need for microtransit. And the definition of microtransit, again, is kind of an on-demand, similar to your Linwood pilot that you're deploying. Lower ranking, but still, something to consider is looking at car share within the transit system, and then finally bike share. But again, kind of those two higher elements, the apps and online services and microtransit, are some things that we'll want to consider as we're thinking about the scenario analysis. So I want to pause there. There's a lot of information about survey findings, some of the just underlying demographics and background context. Are there any questions or just comments related to some of these findings?
I don't see any.
All right. Thank you. So this gets into now our scenario evaluation process. So what goes into the scenarios? We're really leveraging that phase 1 survey, identifying some of the key priorities, some of the key questions that the community has for how community transit can adapt and invest in new services, seeking your input as a board to help inform some of the scenarios. We've presented this to the ELT and employees, getting their input. And then there are just some transit planning principles that go into how we think about where you provide expanded service, how you expand coverage, how you increase frequency, and how does all this integrate with an expanding light rail system. So all of these elements are really driving the scenarios that we'll be evaluating and how we'll be evaluating them. Some of the growth assumptions that go into the scenario evaluation. So your original long range plan from 2011 looked at doubling service hours over that horizon. Now the Vision 2050, the regional transportation plan, identifies service hours at roughly more than double, with upwards of tripling of transit boardings for your system. So for the long range plan for community transit, specifically what we're looking to analyze is how can you best adapt and allocate the resources to support these broader regional trends and really adapt your agency to help grow and foster transit ridership over the next 30 years. So the three scenarios that we'll be evaluating for this process really think about emphasis areas. And the emphasis areas align a bit with those three themes that we've talked about: equity, efficiency, and the environment, but are just looking at how you can allocate different types of service and within different areas to best fulfill those particular priorities. So the first is local service emphasis. And this is really about increasing the frequency of those local connections to that expanded high capacity transit system, particularly light rail extending up to Everett. The second emphasis area is innovative services. And this is really focusing on one of those key elements that were highlighted in the survey, which is to expand service where it currently does not exist. And so this scenario will really look at what are some of those innovative services, whether it's microtransit or other modes that can help expand your service area efficiently and help create those connections to your high capacity, the SWIFT BRT and the light rail networks within the system. And then finally, the third growth emphasis area is about SWIFT and really delivering on what you already have planned and funded, but expanding that, expanding either the network itself, but also looking at doubling down on where you provide SWIFT today and looking at potentially a higher level of service than you've originally planned for. So these three emphasis areas are all around a consistent assumption for the growth of service that's planned up to 2050. And it's thinking about how you allocate that growth to achieve different outcomes and really understand the trade-offs that go with that different allocation. So on the next slide, I really want to talk through in a little more depth what that allocation may look like. So this chart is really highlighting those three growth emphasis areas, which are highlighted on the x-axis, so local service, innovative services, and Swift BRT. And the bars highlight how the percentage of those hours would be allocated in these three different scenarios. So dark blue is representing your local service. So that local service growth emphasis area plans to allocate the highest percentage of the service hours to the local type of service. The innovative services emphasis area would really highlight innovative services, so microtransit and other modes, and really expand on that type of service for this scenario. And then the third scenario, as I mentioned, is Swift BRT. So the highest allocation is around Swift, expanding that Swift network. But I do want to note that all three of these growth emphasis area scenarios have elements of each mode: express, local, Swift, and innovative services. And it's really focused on how you change the allocation and what are some of those particular outcomes from these different allocations. So I want to pause there before I move into the evaluation elements, just to see, are there any clarifying questions in terms of the definition of these scenarios and how we're looking to allocate some of the service hours?
Anybody? Tom.
I had one question on that. It's a quick one. Do you have any correlation between the individuals that answered that ride Swift BRT and the individuals that answered that are using local service only?
It may not be down to a route level at that level of detail, but we did ask some clarifying questions in terms of frequency of use and the kind of the land use context for where they live, so more urban, suburban, or rural. And so we could draw some correlations between those questions and again, get to, yeah, if someone lives in a more urban setting, maybe has some different demographic profile, where do they sit in terms of their need for more Swift service or microtransit, for example. So yeah, we have some of those correlations, just not at a route level.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Aaron, it looks like you're good to move.
All right, great. So any sort of scenario evaluation, obviously one element is defining the right scenarios, ensuring that you're looking at all potential options. The next big piece of this is, how do we evaluate them? How do we ensure that we're measuring what matters with this scenario evaluation process? So a lot of this ties back to the phase one survey results and hearing what are the priorities of the community, what do they want to see in a great transit system. And so we have these evaluation themes that we're really aligned around as we look to evaluate the scenarios. First off is just customer experience. And one potential metric may be just the relative improvement in how you access the system itself. The other themes, equity, efficiency, environment. There are several different metrics that can speak to how you measure equity, how you measure efficiency. These are just some examples that we will be using, but there will be additional metrics that will really speak to the focus on equity, efficiency, and the environment. And then finally, the last two themes, so access to opportunity. This gets at the core of why transit exists. It's to connect people to different opportunities. So one example metric here, and we'll have others, is just how many jobs can the average resident in the area access via transit, and how does that vary geographically or by different demographic groups? We'll be looking at that. And then that final piece is, are there different scenarios? If you invest more in Swift, if you invest more in some of the innovative services or local service, that sets you up better for securing more federal and state grant funding. So that's one element of just kind of that financial stability and the long-term adaptability based on different service types. So besides these evaluation criteria that we'll really highlight at a county-wide level, there are additional elements that will be providing information on how these three scenarios perform. How you expand, the viability of expanding the service area with the scenarios. How does it impact your implementation of paratransit and van pool? Related to the previous discussion, what we'll be looking at is with different service modes and different allocations, is that more suitable to transitioning to zero emission vehicles? Is it maybe more impactful? Are there some other considerations for deploying the services and being able to transition your fleet effectively? That's another element that we'll be looking at. As I mentioned, customer experience will be a big piece, the finance and just the overall operating expenses and potential capital expenses with each of these scenarios. We'll speak to the overall opportunity with speed and reliability investments to improve the overall reliability of the system. And then finally, just looking at, what are some of the workforce implications of transitioning, expanding on your SWIFT network or expanding some of your innovative services. We'll touch on some of those potential outcomes to the workforce element. And then finally, just how best are these scenarios integrating and connecting with the Everett Link extension is some of the other information we'll be analyzing. And just to kind of orient you to how are we going to tell this story and really craft this information. What we'll be looking at is not necessarily network maps. Maybe you're familiar with how the 2024 network planning is underway. We're talking longer term and broader, and so keeping everything at a relatively higher scale. So looking countywide, but understanding, are there some specific geographic differences to how these different scenarios perform? That's how we'll be looking to present some of the information. So for example, here's a map that's kind of conveying a metric on access to opportunity. We'll try to show some of those geographic differences and then speak to the three different scenarios. Are they generally providing a higher level of access or a lower level of access relative to those scenarios? And what we'll be asking the public and asking you as a board is, ultimately, which scenario do you prefer? And, what are some of those priorities you have for how we've evaluated the scenarios? And specifically what we're looking for is two key perspectives. One, as an individual, how do you perceive the scenarios? Would you like to see more SWIFT service? Would you like to see more microtransit or innovative services? But also looking broadly at a county-wide perspective. What do you think benefits the county the most, and which scenario best achieves that? So that's the type of feedback we'll be asking, and really trying to tell the story of, here are the different services, here's how it may look within your community, and here's how these different scenarios perform for your community, and really trying to focus the questions around that particular guidance. So final question I really have for today then is, as we get into this phase 2 outreach and really crafting the story, crafting the materials, we want to be sure that we're providing the right level of information to you as a board to help make a decision to say, okay, we've heard from the community. These are the general scenarios where they lean. These are the criteria that are important. Now we need to make a decision of how to craft a plan moving forward that balances the right level of service, the right type of service, and where that service goes to move into the next phase, which is service planning and capital planning. So I'll pause there. Just again, any clarifying questions on the scenarios, the evaluation criteria, but specifically ensuring that we'll be providing you with the right information to make a decision later on in this process.
Thank you, Aaron. Jan.
Through the whole presentation, I kept thinking about a couple of things, because having a plan, but it needs to be a living document too, especially now. Snohomish County, between now and 2050, are going to have 500,000 more people up here. Jobs are happening rapidly. In my city, 3 years, we're going to have 10,000 new jobs. So while you're putting together the plan, are you also looking at the fact that that plan will probably change every couple of years or adapt to what's happening with our county and the jobs? Because land's going to be an issue. The there is going to be more jobs. People are going to be traveling more because we're running out of space. So is that kind of built in that it's going to be reviewed along the road?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll respond first, and then I'll probably turn it over to Thomas or Rick just in terms of like the next update process. But first off, all of these metrics and the evaluation is looking at that 2050 year horizon. So again, that planned growth that is forecast from PSRC and within each of your respective comp plans, that's a big part of this. And that's really what's driving, where is growth occurring and how can we best adapt some of the services. So that will, establish then this service plan and the capital plan for a long range plan that's adopted, early next year. But that's just the first step. And I think Thomas and or Rick maybe can touch on then what follows from that adoption process, where you then start to implement some of these strategies. But then again, look in whether it's 5 or 10 years to say, okay, let's look back and see how has technology changed, how has some of the land use assumptions changed, and how do, again, we need to adapt to a growingly uncertain future.
Okay, thank you.
Susan.
Unmute myself. Okay. Thank you. And very interesting presentation. I'm sorry that I missed the presentation in October, but of course I wasn't on that as an alternate. My question is that from the earlier outreach to the community and to the others, did you find any gaps in the outreach for the when you did your analysis?
In terms of just who we heard from?
Yeah, and the equity in any neighborhoods, were there any sort of visible, it's like, gosh, we missed this group?
I would say there was one positive and one thing that we want to overcome with the next phase. So the first positive was demographically and also geographically matched up well with the census data and kind of population distribution data. So there wasn't any tilt towards a particular city or just area within the county where it was maybe oversampled or undersampled. And same with demographics, racial and income and age generally tracked with those. So that was a positive finding. Where, as I mentioned, that we certainly were underrepresented were non-riders, or people just haven't tried your services yet. And that was acknowledged because what we elected to do was take a big piece of the notification budget where we were going to send out mailers to really try to capture more non-riders. We moved that into this phase 2 outreach because that's, again, where we're starting to get some more definitive findings and really speaking to some of the information that will help you make a decision to move forward with a chosen path. So the phase 2 outreach, what we hope to do is really boost that non-rider response rate. And in particular, as I mentioned, the feedback that we're trying to get is one, just individually, what scenario, what kind of allocation do I prefer? And so hearing from non-riders to say, oh yeah, doing more, innovative services. Yeah, individually, I would love to see that. But also kind of their perspective of how does this benefit the county, even if they may not ride services themselves, trying to get them to respond is a big piece of the phase 2 outreach. So those are the kind of positives and something we're trying to overcome with the next phase.
Okay, and to follow up with a little bit more, so how often do you expect to go back out to Ms. Schuette's question? Is like, our population is going to grow tremendously and it's going to change over time. How often do you think would be appropriate to go back out to the community and say, are things still tracking the same, and how, what's going to be coming up next? And are we meeting the needs of the community?
Yeah, great question. So just specifically for the long range planning process, we'll be going out again, with this phase 2, we'll be going out a third time as we get a draft plan together and seeking feedback.
All right.
Following from that, then really a lot of the engagement occurs with outreach for your transit development plan, similar, process as you're seeing with the 2024 network planning. So that's really getting into the specifics to say, we have a long range plan now adopted. We have these broad priorities. Here's the general allocation for how service would be deployed. Here are some of the other capital considerations. And then you'd start to see additional feedback as you start to implement some of those elements. And that's where you may course correct, where people, a few years down the road, people, we may start to see perhaps longer term stabilization from the pandemic and work from home. And so we're starting to, have a better sense of some of those commute patterns and just changes in travel behavior. That's the exact time to really kind of look back and say, the assumptions that were in this long range plan that were developed in 2022, are they still valid? Or is there some major shift now that we've observed that we can count on? Again, putting in quotes, count on, because everything changes. But are there some big differences that went into some of those assumptions that we need to kind of go back to the community and say, okay, things have changed a lot in the past 2 years, for example. How does that shift your thinking for the priorities and the role that transit plays in the community?
Sure, I fully expect that as parts of Snohomish County get denser, there's going to be a higher reliance on transit and community level transit along those lines, and so that people don't have to be car reliant, which goes back to the earlier discussions about having the zero emissions and having the climate impacts that we're really hoping for.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Roland, you have a question?
No, I was going to provide a little more of just some background and response in terms of, I think a theme in a couple of the questions has been around the longevity of the plan or our plan for future updates. And I guess one thing I really wanted to highlight is after we adopted our first long range plan back in 2011, a real key feature of this is that this is community transit planning on a countywide scale, but doing it in very close partnership with all of our jurisdictional partners. And it is really a comprehensive planning process. And what we very intentionally did in that first plan was to loop back with our city partners, our county partners, and really integrate our plan into their subsequent comprehensive plan updates and make sure that we were all really pulling in the same direction. And we anticipate, as we track development, Aaron talked about the 2050 projections from PSRC, and that's an overall guiding framework for the plan. But we're also really actively engaged throughout the year with all of our partners in the planning process at Snohomish County tomorrow, at PSRC. And as we are aware of the different developing patterns throughout the county in terms of job growth, residential development, infrastructure implementation, et cetera, we'll be tracking that closely, and we'll be in close conversation with all of you in terms of when is the right time to recognize that conditions have changed and we need to update the plan. So on a general scale, we look at these things on every 5+ years. It's probably time to at least ask the question and revisit. But we're certainly not going to let a trend get ahead of us to any great degree. We'll be in close coordination with all of our partners on that question.
I really appreciate your answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roland. Stephanie.
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on Susan's question, and forgive me if this was sent out. I've been going through the materials and maybe I missed it, but if we could actually have the breakout of who did respond, what areas, cities they're from, age range, things like that, just because I'm somebody who sent it out in my newsletter, and it'd be kind of nice to know, did we get it out far and wide enough down here? Do I need to make a stronger emphasis on it? And I know there was a little confusion. I did hear because there were kind of a lot of entities sending out polls and feedback or wanting feedback over the winter, there was a little confusion. So for me, it'd just be nice to know, out of those 400 people, how many of them were from our areas and things like that, just so we can better target the next couple phases. Thank you.
Yeah, we're actually wrapping up some of the draft survey report. So that's going through some of the iterative comments and review, which gives a lot of detail. You can get into the weeds of some of the correlations, and then some of the specific demographic responses and the geographic differences. So that'll again will also really help inform us for phase 2 of what notification channels were successful in generating some of the responses, and how can we double down on some of those efforts.
Perfect. Thank you. Because I think I my outreach might not always capture people that are younger or using the buses or transit more. So I just want to make sure I retarget better. So thank you.
And thank you, Aaron. Yeah, so my question, you hit on it, and thank you for that, was as we're reaching out, it's probably easier to get feedback from our writers, right? There's many ways that they can do that. And sometimes we hear it just feedback as we're getting off the bus, as Rick and I can attest. I was very happily surprised how many people thanked the drivers as they got off. That was very nice to see. But how, not even sure really how we do it, but what we'd really love to hear from is why people aren't writing, right? Is it a misconception that they think, I can't get there from here? It will take 4 hours, whatever their reason, but it would be good to hear from people. And maybe that turns into a marketing campaign to kind of, clear up some of those maybe misconceptions. And quite frankly, some of them might be true. And that shows us where we can move to service levels or different things like that. Again, not sure how you get there, but I think that would be really helpful, is to hear from those who aren't writing and why.
Yeah.
I think Joe just nailed it. Why aren't you using our service, or why is it hard for you, and what can we do to attract you? So you nailed it, Joe.
Thank you, Steph.
In my case, they won't let me take my chop saw on the bus. So every time I've tried, they've told me I couldn't do it.
Yeah. No chainsaws either.
I expect to see that in the next poll reflected.
Okay. Well, hey, thank you guys. Anything else, Aaron?
Yeah, just final slide, just to kind of touch base on where we are and when we come back to you. So as I mentioned, this is the general scenario framework. These are the 3 buckets that we're really looking at and how we'll be evaluating them, and speaking to those priorities that I mentioned. So we'll be coming back to you all likely in the July timeframe, presenting those results. That will also be kicking off our outreach to again gather that feedback on preferences and priorities for these different scenarios. So look for that coming in July. We have a lot of technical modeling, technical analysis. This is kind of the transit nerd in all of us. We get to really test out some of these assumptions and opportunities. So we'll be producing that information, and specifically our focus is how to tell this story clearly. There's a lot of information. So our role is really about how to distill this into a way so it's really easy to digest, understand some of the different trade-offs of these different scenarios and allocations. So look for that in Q3, and then we'll get into the specifics over the course of the fall and winter to really develop the specific service and capital elements of this. So again, really appreciate your feedback and time today, and I think I can turn it back over to Rick.
Hey, and I just lastly, too, thank you, Aaron, and Steph mentioned it a little bit, and that she sends out her communications. But to the degree that you have questions, or you have one online that has like a QR code or something, I could certainly put it in our newsletter that goes out to all our residents to get their feedback if they're so willing to log in there and do that. I'm sure a lot of the cities here would, and maybe that would up who you're hearing from, where you're hearing from them, and certainly people who aren't writing as well.
We will definitely coordinate at that level. Take advantage of every opportunity to push out our material. I think to your broader point, and it's been emphasized by several about reaching folks more broadly, there are lots of different ways we can engage in that kind of research, public opinion research, focus group research, phone surveys. So we'll take that as direction to redouble our efforts in that regard. I think Aaron flagged it, and there's a lot of tools in the toolbox we can bring to bear on it. So I'll look forward to coming back after the next round with hopefully a broader picture. I think that's it for today, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the board for its engagement. This was a long workshop with really hefty topics. This is legacy stuff. We want to be an organization that performs well every day with the essential service we provide, but we also want to lean forward and keep an eye on the horizon and make sure that we're making those adjustments and those course changes we need to support the county as best we can into the future. And so this this is part of that work, and it's really fun. So I want to just again thank you for your engagement and the feedback and the direction we've gotten here on both topics, and we'll take that to inform our work going forward and circle back at the next opportunity with more information.
All right. Thank you, Rick. So for my report, I just say again, a big thank you to Rick and Jim for allowing me to go out with them and ride for a couple of hours on the Swift line and kind of really see, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And like I said, there was a lot of good. Ridership looked good. I was amazed how many people actually getting off said thank you very much to the drivers. So there's that respect. And then of course there's the not so good side of people who ride the bus for various reasons and trying to sell their various sundries and just all kinds of different things that we were able to see. But it continues to be the focus and kind of evading that, and that seems to be working. And then also for the groundbreaking, it was not only great that it turned out to be a pretty good day and no rain, which you can't count on this time of year, but just the turnout that we had, having the governor and the senators and our representatives and I think 3 Congress people and the FTA secretary, it just tells you how much they value what we're doing here. And so, and along that too, thinking that day of what a great job that Rick's doing, and glad that you came on board at a good time. Wasn't the easiest time, but you're doing a great job in leading the organization. And I just want to say thank you for that. If there's any more communication, rather than going through and picking names, just raise your hand and I will call on you as they see it. That way, if people would like to comment, you certainly can. You don't have to, because I'm not seeing any hands. All right, if I don't see any, we will then, still not, we can adjourn unless there's any other business, Rick. Okay, well, we will adjourn to our next meeting, which, well, you will know when it is.
It's next board meeting will be Cinco de Mayo.
Oh, Cinco de Drinko. All right.
Well, hopefully that will be our final virtual board meeting. We still got some loose ends to tie up over at the Cascade building, but we're working hard to get to that June board meeting. But May 5th is the next opportunity to convene.
All right, May 5th, we'll see you then. And yeah, get ready to be in person. We're excited. All right. Guys, all have a great
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.